When last we sailed with them, the Straw Hat Pirates had crossed into the Grand Line and taken aboard a runaway princess. Nefertari Vivi of the Desert Kingdom of Alabasta had uncovered a terrible secret, that the beloved hero of her country, the warlord Crocodile, was in truth the hidden master of the criminal syndicate Baroque Works, and that he was engineering a rebellion to seize her kingdom for himself. Now Vivi was racing home to stop a war before it could destroy everything she loved, and 5 pirates and a large, loyal, spot-billed duck named Karoo had decided to help her get there. But the Grand Line does not let anyone travel in a straight line. Between the little Going Merry and the Desert Kingdom lay a prehistoric island of dueling giants, a frozen kingdom lost in the clouds and more danger than any of them could yet imagine. This is the story of how a lonely doctor joined the crew, how a princess said goodbye without a single word, and how one rubber pirate brought the rain back to a dying country. This is the Alabasta saga. The log pose, that strange compass which locks onto one island's magnetism and then points the way to the next, led them to a place that should not still exist. It was an island of towering jungle and steaming, erupting volcanoes, where enormous dinosaurs still stalked the undergrowth and prehistoric beasts screamed in the mist, a lost world, marooned out of its own time. Some long-ago explorer had scrawled a mocking name across it on his chart. He had called it Little Garden. It was neither little nor a garden, and the crew nearly became a dinosaur's meal within the first hour of setting foot on it. The island's 2 most remarkable residents found them soon enough. On opposite sides of that jungle lived a pair of colossal warriors, giants, each of them taller than the Going Merry's mast, hailing from a far-off island of warriors called Elbaf. Their names were Dory and Brogy, and for 100 years the 2 of them had been locked in a single endless duel. Long ago, the story went, they had each gone out hunting and returned to argue over whose kill had been the greater, and neither proud warrior would ever concede the point. The original quarrel scarcely mattered to them anymore. What mattered was their honor as men of Elbaf, and so every single day for a full century, the 2 old friends met in the same scorched clearing, roared with laughter, and crossed their blades, unwilling to lie down and die until they had proven, once and for all, which of them was the strongest. To Luffy, and to Usopp especially, it was the most magnificent thing they had ever laid eyes on. Usopp looked at these 2 laughing, unbreakable giants, still fighting for their pride after 100 years, and saw the whole of what he wanted to become. There were other hunters in that jungle, too. A pair of Baroque Works agents named Mr. 5 and Miss Valentine had chased Vivi all the way from Wiskey Peak, hungry to silence the princess who had learned their master's secret, one of them able to turn any part of his own body, even his breath, into a bomb, the other able to make herself drop with the crushing weight of a boulder. Between the exploding man, the falling woman, the wax master's traps, the wandering dinosaurs, and the rivers of lava, Little Garden did its honest best to kill the whole crew a dozen times over that day, and through all of it, Luffy, being Luffy, was mostly delighted. He wanted to ride the dinosaurs, and then he wanted to eat them, and he very nearly managed both. But Baroque Works had followed the princess even here. 2 of Crocodile's agents were waiting on the island, Mr. 3, a cold and clever man named Galdino, whose wax power let him coat anything in rock-hard, quick-drying wax, and his small, unbothered, candy-loving partner, Miss Goldenweek. And the pair had a cruel, patient plan. Mr. 3 intended to murder the 2 giants, seal the entire Straw Hat crew inside a slowly hardening wax sculpture, and leave them all as permanent statues, perfectly preserved, easy to haul in for the fortune of bounties on their heads. To break the giants' 100-year stalemate in his favor, he crept out and slipped an explosive into the wine that old Dory drank before each duel. And so when the 2 friends next clashed, Dory was torn open by a blast from within, and, unable to understand how he had been so gravely wounded, he began, for the first time in a century, to suspect his old rival Brogy of a coward's dishonorable blow. The trust between the 2 giants, unbroken for 100 years, started to crack. The crew scattered to save them. There was a cleverness to it too. Sanji, separated from the others, intercepted one of Baroque Works' snail phones and, keeping his voice smooth, impersonated an agent to pull the enemy's whole plan out into the open, inventing for himself, on the spot, a grand secret agent alias he called Mr. Prince, a joke that would come back to matter more than anyone expected. But cleverness alone wasn't enough. Luffy, Nami, and Vivi were nearly turned to wax themselves, entombed alive in Mr. Three's grand, slowly setting sculpture. Zoro, his own legs caught fast in the hardening wax, calmly decided he would simply cut his own feet off rather than be captured. That was the resolve the crew carried, plainly and without drama. In the end, Usopp and the ever-faithful Karoo shattered Mr. Best. Three's concentration at the crucial moment, Luffy tore free, and the wax man was sent flying. And the two giants, learning at last that their broken duel had been the work of a stranger's cowardly trick and not each other's hands, turned 100 years of terrible, gleeful fury on Baroque Works side by side, their friendship proven, in the end, wholly unbroken. Grateful, and roaring with laughter once more, Dory and Brogy sped the little ship on toward Alabasta and stood together at the shore to see it off, already lifting their swords to resume the duel they would happily fight for another 100 years. Usopp watched them shrink into the distance and swore, quietly, that one day he would be a brave warrior worthy of standing beside giants like those. But there was a shadow over the leaving. Below deck, Nami had suddenly collapsed, burning up with a violent fever. Something was badly, dangerously wrong, and there was no doctor anywhere aboard. Nami's fever climbed until her life hung by a thread. She had been bitten, it turned out, by a rare and deadly tick, and without a real doctor she had only a handful of days to live. Frantic, the crew drove the Going Merry across the sea in search of any land with a physician, and the log post delivered them to a kingdom buried in snow, a wall of white mountains rising straight up out of a freezing winter ocean. It was called Drum Island, the Drum Kingdom, and once it had been famous across the whole of the Grand Line for having the finest doctors in all the world. But a grief hung over this place too. The villagers who met them on the snow were frightened and bitter, and they told a painful story. Their kingdom no longer had a king worth the name. Their ruler had been a gluttonous, cruel tyrant named Wapol, who had rounded up every last doctor in the country, 20 of them, to serve only him and his court, and left the common people to sicken and die untreated. And then, when a pirate crew so monstrous and terrifying had appeared off their shores that even a king lost his nerve, Wapol had simply fled the country, abandoning every one of his people to save his own hide. That terrible crew flew a flag that would come to mean a great deal, later in another country entirely, but that is a thread for further along. For now, what mattered was that Drum was leaderless and afraid, and that there was, the villagers admitted, exactly one doctor left in the whole kingdom. She lived at the very peak of the tallest mountain, and they spoke of her as a witch, a 140-year-old physician named Dr. Kureha, and they said that something lived up there with her, a monster. There was one man in that frightened kingdom, still trying to do right by its people. A gentle, powerful guard captain named Dalton, who had himself eaten a devil fruit that let him take on the strength and shape of a great bison, and who had never stopped quietly protecting the villagers from the worst of Wapol's cruelty. It was Dalton who helped the desperate crew, and who pointed them up the mountain toward the one doctor left, but the way up was murder. The lower slopes were the hunting ground of the Lapans. Enormous, powerful snow-white rabbits, strong enough to trigger avalanches with a single stamp, and the cold alone could kill an unprepared traveler in hours. Luffy did the only thing that Luffy has ever done. With the feverish Nami strapped to his back and Sanji climbing at his side, he began to scale the sheer, frozen cliffs of that mountain with his bare hands, through the driving snow and the screaming wind, past the avalanches and the giant rabbits, because a friend needed help and there was a doctor. At the top, and that was, to him, the entire beginning and end of the matter. And near the summit, at last, they met the monster the whole island so feared. He was a small, blue-nosed reindeer who stood on two legs and spoke in a human voice, and his name was Tony Chopper. Chopper had eaten the devil fruit, the human fruit, and it had given an ordinary reindeer the mind, the voice, and the shifting shape of a human being. But it had also left him belonging to no world at all. His own herd drove him out for carrying a human scent and walking upright on 2 legs, and the humans, when they saw a talking beast come out of the snow, screamed that he was a monster and shot at him and chased him away. He was as alone as it is possible to be. Until one day a ragged, laughing old man found him, a self-proclaimed doctor who called himself Dr. Hiluluk. Hiluluk was, by his own cheerful admission, very nearly a quack, a man whose cures rarely worked and who was chased through town as often as thanked. But he believed, with the whole of his enormous heart, 2 things: that there was no such thing in all the world as a disease that could not be cured, and that one day he would heal his whole sick, frightened, tyrannized country. And when everyone else in the world saw a monster in the snow, Hiluluk saw her child. He took the reindeer in, he gave him his name, he taught him patiently over years that he was not a monster at all, that there was nothing in this world he needed to be afraid of. For the first time in his life, Chopper had a family. Hiluluk even gave him something to believe in, a flag, a skull crowned with a single blossom, which the old man said stood for a spirit that would face anything and never ever be afraid. And here, gently, the story becomes one of the saddest and most beautiful in all of these seas. Dr. Hiluluk was dying. His body had been failing quietly for years, and he knew that his time had very nearly run out. And Chopper, desperate, frantic to save the one soul who had ever loved him, ran out alone into a blizzard and climbed a deadly cliff to fetch a certain mushroom that he was absolutely certain would cure anything at all, because the old book had shown its marking and he was sure the mark meant life. But the little reindeer had misread it. The mushroom was a terrible poison, and the skull upon it was a warning, not a promise. Hiluluk understood exactly what it was the very moment he saw it, and he took the soup that Chopper had so carefully made from it, and he drank down every last drop, smiling the whole time, telling the anxious boy that it was the most delicious thing he had ever tasted in his life, because he could not bear, not for anything, to break the heart of the child who had tried so hard and so wrongly to save him. Then Hiluluk, already dying, with soldiers on their way to arrest him, chose for himself the ending that he wanted. Rather than fade away, he swallowed a potion of his own making, and with a broad smile on his face he let himself go out all at once, like a firework over the snow, on his own terms, upright, unbroken, and unafraid. His final words are ones that Chopper, and the whole crew, and everyone who ever hears this story, carries with them forever. "When do you think a man dies?" the old doctor asked. "It is not when he is shot through the heart with a bullet. It is not when he is ravaged by an incurable disease. It is not when he swallows a poisonous mushroom." He grinned. "A man dies when he has forgotten. And then, at the very last, this is the perfect ending. My life, it was worth living. Thank you." And he was gone. Everything the little reindeer would ever learn about medicine, he learned afterward, over 6 hard years, from the fierce old witch Dr. Correa, who took the grieving orphan in as her apprentice. But it was Hiluluk in the end who had taught him the only thing that truly mattered, why a doctor bothers to heal at all. Dr. Correa was a piece of work all her own. A cackling, sharp-tongued, impossibly spry old woman who wore a grinning skull on her shirt and flatly refused to tell anyone her real age, though she would happily admit, with a wink, to 141 years. Beneath all the drinking and the mockery, though, she was one of the most brilliant physicians anywhere on the Grand Line, and for 6 long years she had poured everything she knew into the greeting little reindeer until Hiluluk's frightened orphan had grown into a genuine, capable doctor in his own right. So when Walpole's henchmen came storming up the mountain, Chopper did not run and did not hide. He fought them with the strange, shifting gift of his devil fruit, swelling into a towering, brawny monster one moment, shrinking to a small darting creature the next, no longer ashamed of what he was, but using it, at long last, to defend the memory and the dream of the one man who had ever loved him. Into this raw, grieving, snowbound place, in the present, the exiled tyrant Walpole came crawling back. He had fled the moment true danger appeared, and now that the danger was gone, he returned to seize his throne again and to punish the people who had dared to live without him. Armed with his monk power, which let him devour absolutely anything, stone and steel and cannon fire alike, and reshape it into armor and weapons, and flanked by his loyal henchmen, he climbed the mountain to the old castle, and he mocked the memory of dead Dr. Hululuk to Chopper's face, and he tore at the flag with the skull and the blossom that flew above it, the flag that stood for facing anything without fear. And this time, Luffy was there. When Walpole sneered at the dead doctor's dream, Luffy, with Chopper fighting furiously at his side at last, wound back a rubber fist and blasted the gluttonous king clean off the mountain and out of the kingdom for good, so that the flag stayed flying and did not fall. And then, at the very end, Dr. Kureha gave the whole grieving country back its heart. Long ago, Hululuk had cherished one impossible dream above every other, to see the cherry blossoms bloom over the frozen kingdom, to make it snow pink, because he believed, with his quack's unkillable faith, that such a sight could cure the sickness in his people's spirit in a way that no medicine ever could. He had died long before he could ever make it happen. But the old witch had quietly kept his final work alive. And now, over those white winter mountains, in the cold bright air, she made the sky itself bloom. Pale pink cherry blossoms, sakura, came drifting down over the entire snowbound kingdom, thick and soft as warm snow, and the people stopped and looked up and wept openly at the sight, and Chopper, sobbing in the falling pink, understood at last that his father's dream had not died with him, after all. Hululuk had not been forgotten. In that one shining moment, under a sky full of blossoms he had dreamed into being, the old doctor was more alive than he had ever been. Nami was cured. The fierce old witch treated her deadly fever without much trouble. The kingdom, finally rid of its tyrant, chose a good and gentle former guard captain named Dalton to lead it forward into something better, and Luffy wanted the little reindeer doctor for his crew. Chopper wanted, more than anything, to go with them, but he was terrified, still half convinced in his heart that a monster like him could never truly belong anywhere. He tried to refuse. He wept and told them, hiding behind a snowbank, that they should just sail on without him, that of course they couldn't really want a monster aboard. Luffy would not hear a word of it. "Shut up," he called back, laughing, tears in his own eyes, "and let's geo." And, just like that, the loneliest creature on the whole mountain was wanted and chosen, and part of a family once more. Tony Chopper came down out of the snow and became the doctor of the Straw Hat Pirates, carrying his dead father's dream, and that flag of the skull and the blossom, out with him onto the sea. At last, the crew's heading brought them to Alabasta itself, a vast and ancient kingdom of golden desert, of wide rivers and grand-walled cities, a land that had stood in peace and plenty for centuries. But that long peace was cracking apart. For 3 years, almost no rain at all had fallen anywhere across the country. Anywhere, that is, except over the royal capital, where the clouds still gathered as though by some cruel favoritism. And the people, parched and starving and burying their dead, had come to a terrible conclusion, that their own king, Nefertari Cobra, was somehow hoarding the very rain for himself. A great rebel army had risen up out of that despair, hundreds of thousands strong, led by a fierce and grieving young man named Koza, and the whole kingdom was sliding day by day toward a civil war that would grind it into dust. Vivi had come home at last, to a country on the verge of murdering itself. And none of it, not one single piece of it, was real. It was all Crocodile's long and patient design. For years the warlord had played the part of Alabasta's beloved hero while his agents quietly manufactured the country's suffering, and while he framed the good King Cobra using a stolen cargo of illegal rain, making dance powder, planted so that the desperate people would believe their king had stolen the sky, All of it was meant to drive the nation into open rebellion, so that amid the chaos and the slaughter, Crocodile could sweep in, rescue the ruined kingdom, and take its throne. But even the throne was not his true prize. Buried somewhere beneath Alabasta lay something older and far more dangerous, a great stone that recorded a history the rulers of the world had long ago erased by force, and, perhaps, the sleeping location of an ancient weapon of terrible power. That, in the end, was what Crocodile truly hunted. There was one more meeting in that desert, brief, warm, and enormous, that would echo across everything still to come. In the bustling port town of Nanohana, with the marine officer named Smoker closing in on the Straw Hat's trail, Luffy suddenly found himself rescued by a man reefed head to foot in living fire. Port guestee Ace, a commander of one of the divisions of the mightiest pirate crew on the seas, the Whitebeard Pirates, and the wielder of the flame, Flamefruit. And Ace, astonishingly, was Luffy's older brother, the two of them raised together as boys, bound by a bond far deeper than blood. Ace had come to the Grand Line on a hunt of his own. He was tracking a traitor, a man who had once served under him and then murdered a crewmate and fled, a pirate named Blackbeard. The two brothers shared a single quiet meal together in the desert, and Ace thanked the crew with real feeling for looking after his reckless little brother. Before he left to resume the chase, he pressed a small, worn scrap of paper into Luffy's hand. A Viver card made from a living person's own life force. A paper that would always point the way back to him and would tell Luffy someday whether he was still alive. "We'll meet again," Ace told him, easy and certain. "At the top." He turned to the rest of the crew then, and thanked them, with a sudden and genuine warmth, for looking after his reckless little brother, a brother who had, moments before, needed exactly that kind of looking after, since Ace had first appeared only to drive off the relentless marine, Smoker, who had cornered Luffy in the crowded port. There was a whole world behind that easy grin. A mighty pirate emperor named Whitebeard who called Ace his son, a childhood the two brothers had shared and sworn over long ago. But Ace let almost none of it show. He simply ruffled his brother's hair, shouldered his pack, and walked off alone into the shimmering dunes to resume his hunt. And that other name, Blackbeard, drifted away on the hot desert wind behind him, small and unremarked and quietly world-changing. Hold on to it. To reach the capital and stop the war, the crew had to cross the great desert itself, and it was a hard and revealing road. They passed through the ruined, sand-choked husks of towns the drought had killed, and through the rebel city of Yuba, where an old man dug and dug at the smothering sand each night, alone, refusing to give up on a well the desert kept burying. There Vivi's own history came clear, how the rebellion's leader, Koza, had been her dear childhood friend, how the two of them had once believed they could protect this country together, and how the lie Crocodile had spun had set the whole kingdom, friend against itself. And they had help on the road, too, a squadron of enormous, fast, spot-billed ducks, kin to the faithful Karoo, who carried the whole crew flat out across the sands toward the capital of Alubarna, racing the war itself. The desert road broke Vivi's heart by inches, and it changed her crew. They crossed a land of endless golden dunes under a merciless sun, rationing their water, learning from the princess the name and the history of every ruined place they passed. They walked to Aramalu, a town once so green and alive it had been called the City of Green, now nothing but a silent skeleton of empty houses half swallowed by the sand, strangled slowly to death by the drought. They rested in Yuba, the town where the rebellion itself had first been born, and there they met a stubborn, leathery old man named Toto, the father of the rebel leader, Koza, who dug alone through every single night for a well that the sand simply swallowed again by every morning, and who refused, absolutely and stubbornly refused, to give up on his home even as everyone around him marched away to war. Everywhere Vivi turned, she saw her country dying by degrees, old neighbors taking up arms against one another, and she carried the unbearable knowledge that every last piece of it had been manufactured, patiently, deliberately, coldly, by the very man her own people still cheered in the streets as their hero and their savior. More than once, the sheer weight of it nearly crushed her flat. But her crew, in their loud and clumsy and utterly unshakable way, simply would not let her carry it alone, and somewhere out on those burning sands the runaway princess quietly stopped being a passenger they were escorting home, and became, without anyone quite saying so, one of their own. Then the trap in the desert closed. Crocodile set his final plan into motion, a scheme he called Operation Utopia. He would let the two great armies, the king's soldiers and the rebels, smash headlong into each other in the streets of the capital, and then, at the very height of the slaughter, he would detonate an enormous bomb hidden in the central plaza, a bomb powerful enough to wipe out everyone at once. Both armies, every citizen, the king, the rebel leaders, and every last trace of what he had done. Out of that crater he would raise his own perfect kingdom. And so Vivi's whole desperate, sleepless quest came down at the end to one nearly impossible task: reach the two armies and make them stop, before the bomb turned her home into a grave. They reached the capital of Alabasta just barely ahead of the war, and there the crew did something clever and desperate. Knowing that Crocodile's officers were hunting the princess through the city and did not know all of their faces, the straw hats scattered in every direction at once, each of them running a different way so that the assassins could never be sure which fleeing figure was actually shielding Vivienne, which was a decoy meant to lead them off. It split the whole crew apart, each of them suddenly alone in a burning city against a professional killer, which is precisely how the duels began. To buy her even the chance to try, the straw hats scattered through the burning, war-torn capital, and one by one they each took on an officer of Baroque works, each of them holding a deadly assassin at bay so that the princess could keep running. It was here that Zorro faced the very deadliest of Crocodile's agents, Mr. One, a swordsman named Daz Bones, whose devil fruit had turned his entire body into living, razor steel, so that ordinary blades simply shattered against him. Pushed all the way to the brink of death, cut and bleeding and unable to land a single telling blow, Zorro finally understood something he had chased his whole life. He stilled himself and heard what he would call the breath of all things, and in that instant learned to cut through steel itself, striking Mr. One down and taking an enormous stride toward the world's greatest swordsman dream he had carried since he was a boy in a dojo. Sanji dueled a strange and flamboyant enemy called Mystery. 2. Bon Clay, an outrageous, big-hearted Okama with the power to perfectly copy the face and body of anyone he had ever touched, a man who had, not long before and without ever realizing it, genuinely befriended these very pirates and who fought them now with real grief hidden beneath all the paint. And the pirouettes. Nami, armed for the very first time with a clever collapsible weather staff that Usopp had built for her, a strange rod that could conjure wind and rain and lightning out of the dry desert air, outthought and outfought the sharp blade-fingered assassin Miss Doublefinger, and won the first true battle of her own life. And Usopp and Chopper teamed up together, terrified and hopelessly outmatched by a hulking agent and his monstrous animal partners, found between the two of them just enough raw courage and just enough desperate cleverness to pull off a victory that neither could ever have managed alone. These were not the same frightened people who had left the East Blue. Each of them, tested now far past anything they had ever faced, and each of them standing entirely alone, somehow found a way to win and to survive. Beneath all the noise of the battle, Crocodile went after the thing he had truly come to Alabasta for. He seized King Cobra himself and forced the old king to lead him down into the tomb of the royal family, to a great block of indestructible black stone covered in an ancient, forbidden script, a poneglyph, one of the scattered stones that hold the true history of a lost age, a history the rulers of the world had killed and killed again to erase. Crocodile was certain the stone recorded where an ancient weapon of unimaginable power lay sleeping, a weapon called Pluton, and he meant to raise it and hold the whole of the seas to ransom. But there was only one person left alive in all the world who could still read that lost writing, and she was standing right at his shoulder, Nico Robin. She looked at the stone and she told him calmly that it said nothing of any weapon at all. Whether the ancient stone truly held its silence, or whether Robin, who had her own long, secret, lifelong reasons for wanting that knowledge, simply chose not to hand it to a monster, Crocodile had no way to know. Cheated of his true prize at the very last, he turned on her. In the streets of the capital, Koza himself, the rebel leader, at last saw the truth of how he had been used and did a brave and desperate thing. He climbed up before Bo's armies, waving a great white flag, screaming for the fighting to stop, begging his own people to put down their weapons. And one of Crocodile's hidden agents shot him down where he stood from the shadows to keep the war burning, because a peace now would ruin everything the warlord had built. The two armies, seeing their peacemaker fall, roared and threw themselves at each other harder than ever, and the battle became a massacre in the making. And Luffy went straight for Crocodile himself. It did not go well, not at first, and not for a long time. Crocodile was a Logia, a sand man whose whole body could turn to flowing desert. Fists passed clean through him and struck nothing, and with a single touch of his palm he could pull every drop of water and life out of whatever he held. In their first clash, at the warlord's casino in the city of Rainbase, Crocodile toyed with Luffy, dried him half to a husk, and left the whole crew locked in a cage above a pool set to fill with water and drown them. Only Sanji's cunning, still wearing his Mr. Starchy, Prince Disguise, and a wax key forced out of the captured Mr. 3, got them free, and Luffy even freed the trapped Marine Smoker on his way out, an act the Smoke Man would not forget. Crocodile beat Luffy a second time, worse, running him clean through and pouring poison into him from the vicious hidden hook he wore in place of one hand, until Luffy hung right at the very edge of death and had to be dragged back from it. Anyone else, twice broken, would have stayed down for good. But Luffy had understood, between those two defeats, the one simple thing in all the world that could defeat a man made of sand. Water. Wet sand becomes heavy mud, and mud cannot turn to dust and slip away. So in their third and final battle, deep beneath the capital in the ancient waterways, Luffy soaked the warlord through, and when the water ran out, he used his own streaming blood in its place, forcing Crocodile's sand body to stay solid and real, unable to scatter, and then he drew back a single, tremendous, unstoppable blow and drove it clean through the man, blasting him up and out through the underground aqueduct and ending his long reign in one strike. The invincible hero of Alabasta, undone at the last by a rubber boy who simply would not let a kingdom die. High above, meanwhile, the great bomb had already been fired into the packed plaza, its blast wide enough to erase the entire capital, its fuse burning down over tens of thousands of soldiers. And a royal guard named Pell, a warrior who carried the power of a mighty falcon and who loved his country far more than his own life, spread his wings, seized the enormous bomb in his talons, and flew. Up and up and up, straight into the sky, faster than anyone could follow, until he was a speck against the sun, high above the whole city, and there the bomb burst harmlessly in the open air. He gave his life in that instant so that his people might live to see another morning. And Vivi, standing between the two armies at last, hoarse and sobbing and still screaming at them all to stop, was finally answered, not by any voice, but by the sky itself. For the first time in 3 long, cruel years over the whole of Alabasta, the rain began to fall. The soldiers on both sides went still. They lowered their swords and turned their faces up and wept like children as the drought broke at long last and the rain they had been ready to slaughter one another over came pouring down, warm and endless, upon them all. There was one last cruelty and one last mercy beneath the city. Crocodile's mysterious partner, the calm, dark-haired woman who had shadowed the crew from the very first island of the Grand Line, Miss All-Sunday, whose true name was Miko Robin, had followed the warlord this whole way for one reason only, to reach that ancient buried stone, the one thing she had wanted for her entire life. And when the stone did not reveal to Crocodile the terrible secret he had demanded of it, He turned on her without a flicker of feeling, wounded her, and left her behind to die in the collapsing dark. She was ready to die. She had been ready, quietly, for a very long time. But Luffy would not permit it. He pulled her from the rubble and carried her up into the light along with the wounded king, without her asking and without a second thought, for no reason at all except that he would not ever simply stand and watch a person die in front of him. And the days that followed, the wounded country began, very slowly, to breathe again. The brave Falcon Guard Pell, against every possible expectation, was found alive beneath the rubble. It seemed that even a bomb blast in the open sky could not quite finish off a man who loved his home that fiercely. The people learned, at last, the whole truth of who had really poisoned their kingdom and stolen their reign, and the false hero's celebrated name turned to ash in their mouths. And the 6 weary, battered, half-starved straw hats were quietly smuggled into the royal palace and cared for like honored guests, bathed and bandaged and fed until they physically could not move, and then, being precisely who they were, promptly turning a royal bath and a royal feast into cheerful chaos. For a few short, warm, golden days, a crew of hunted pirates rested safe and sound inside a grateful king's own home. There was still the matter of getting out alive. The Marines had come down on Alabasta in force, hunting the pirates who had been at the very center of it all, and they closed in on the exhausted crew as they tried to slip quietly away. And here an unlikely thing happened. Mr. Friend 2, Bon Clay, the flamboyant, big-hearted Okama that Sanji had beaten, the enemy who had somewhere along the way come to genuinely, ridiculously love these people, took his own ship and his own loyal crew, and led the entire marine fleet off in precisely the wrong direction, throwing away his own. Clean escape so that the Straw Hats could get free. It was a debt of pure friendship that the crew had never asked for and would never forget, and it would come back, in a far darker place than any of them could yet imagine, to save their lives. The kingdom was saved, and the quiet, exhausted days that followed, sheltered and healing in the palace of the very king she had crossed the world to reach, Vivi faced the hardest choice of her whole life. She loved these pirates, 6 of them now, with the little reindeer, more than she had words for. They had bled for her country as though it were their own, asked for nothing, and expected nothing. And a part of her longed, achingly, to raise a sail and go with them, out into the boundless adventure of the grand line that stretched ahead. But she was the princess of Alabasta, and her people were wounded and grieving and beginning the long work of rebuilding, and she knew, in the deepest part of herself, exactly where she was needed and exactly where she belonged. So in the end, there was no spoken goodbye at the harbor, because an open, tearful farewell between a princess and a crew of hunted pirates could brand her forever a friend of criminals, and undo the very peace they had all bled for. Instead, as the Going Merry slipped away from the shore of Alabasta and out toward the sea, Vivi stood on a high dune with faithful Karoo beside her, and she called one last question across the widening water, asking whether, if they should somehow ever meet again, they might still call one another friends after everything. And the crew answered her without so much as a single word. Every one of them lifted their left arm high into the bright air and turned it to show the bold black X they had each drawn there, the mark of a private promise, a bond that no border and no law and no distance could ever touch. And Vivi, tears streaming down her face, lifted her own arm, the very same mark upon it, and held it up as high as she could reach, and kept it there, until the little sheep-headed ship was nothing but a speck against the shining horizon. Some friendships, it turns out, do not need to be spoken aloud. They only need to be kept. And the crew that sailed away was not, it turned out, quite as small as the crew that had arrived. Once the Going Merry found the open sea, they discovered a stowaway sitting calmly on the sunny deck as though she had been there all along. Nico Robin, the woman who had, until yesterday, been their enemy, the last surviving officer of Baroque Works. She had simply let herself aboard their ship, and now she informed them, pleasantly, that she was joining the crew. The others were wary, and every one of them had good reason to be. But Robin quietly explained the one thing that had changed everything for her. She had wanted, for most of her life, to die. Hunted since she was a small child, cast out of every place she had ever tried to belong, utterly alone in the world with a bounty on her head. Crocodile had been perfectly willing to grant her that death. And Luffy, without ever meaning to, without even being asked, had stolen it away from her. He had saved a life she herself had long ago given up on, and in doing so had left her holding the strangest and most frightening gift imaginable, the plain desire to keep on living. "You made me want to live," she told them simply, "so take me with you, out to sea." And Luffy, of course, grinned and said yes before she had even finished asking. Just who Nico Robin truly was. The one person left alive in all the world who could still read the forbidden stones that hold the history of a lost century. A woman hunted by the whole of the world government since she was a child of 8 years old, carrying inside her the buried secret of an age that the rulers of the world had killed and killed again to erase. Well, that is a story for the chapters still far ahead. For tonight, she was simply the seventh of the Straw Hats, a soft-spoken archaeologist with a small, knowing smile, settling in on the deck of a little ship as it carried its crew of dreamers on toward the next far horizon. And that is where we will leave them for tonight. A princess safe at last in her healing kingdom, standing in the first rain in 3 years. A lonely reindeer who finally, truly found his family. A woman who chose, against the whole weight of her long grief, to live. And one small ship, a little more crowded than before, sailing on into the wide and open blue. Let's take a slow breath together and remember everything this stretch of the journey gave them. 2 giants who showed a frightened liar exactly what 100 years of courage looks like. A doctor who died smiling so that a child would not have to weep, and a whole sky full of pink blossoms that proved, forever, that he would never be forgotten. A brother in the desert, and a name carried off on the wind. A dying kingdom pulled back from the very edge of ruin by a boy who simply would not let it fall. A farewell said with nothing but a raised arm, and a friendship strong enough to reach clear across an ocean. And a new companion, sitting quietly on the deck, her own long and secret story only just beginning. The floating islands high up in the sky, the lost city of gold hidden among the clouds, and all the friends and all the enemies still waiting far beyond the horizon. All of that lies ahead of us in the chapters yet to come. But there is no need at all to rush toward any of it now. For tonight, simply let the little ship sail on, through calm and gentle water beneath a wide and quiet sky, a crew of 7 dreamers carried softly forward by the very same old promise. Rest easy. The Grand Line will still be there, waiting when you wake.